Good morning. Thank you very much for attending this webinar. My name is Charles Nord. I am Head of Product at Action Sustainability. We're a consultancy organization that primarily work in the sustainability space. We do a lot of client work around sustainable supply chain management and sustainable procurement. We also have a flagship program, which is known as the Supply Chain Sustainability School, that provides a wealth of free learning resources to SMEs in the UK and around the world as well. Notably, we've recently launched in um, Ireland, in the United States, in Australia, and we provide free learning around sustainability. Mostly aimed for organisation in the built environment, so in construction infrastructure, but really applicable a lot of the times to many organisations and many different types of sectors. In my role, I operate a reporting platform, and as part of that, a lot of the clients that I work with need to comply in the UK with SECR, Streamlined Energy and Carbon Reporting regulation that the government has set. So today I'll bring a little bit of experience in terms of how to go about that, and hopefully sort of give you the basics in terms of what you need to do, actually do need to comply or not, answering those questions. We've got an hour for the webinar. I will be presenting. You've got an opportunity in Zoom, sorry, to write in the chat. So I'll be monitoring that. Feel free to drop any questions, comments, and I happily sort of pick those up as I go along and try and answer some of your questions. Also, I'm using a slide deck which will be shared afterwards to everyone present here today. So you'll get access to those slides. We'll send them in PDF format via email straight after this session. I will also mention one or two links, so I'll include those links in the follow-up email, and there'll be my contact details. So you can reach out and ask me any questions afterward. Anything that I've not covered, just feel free to reach out. The agenda for today is really we're gonna go back to basics, and actually before we go in and talk about streamlined energy and carbon reporting, we're going to actually look at what do we mean by carbon emissions, how do we measure carbon emissions, and all of that is going to set us up really nicely to then understand, well, how do we comply with this government requirement around that's known as SECR. So I'll explain that sort of the part of this session. As I go throughout, hopefully I'll be giving some practical tips for compliance. And as I mentioned, there's an opportunity for you to use the chat on Zoom to ask me questions, but there'll be some time at the end where you can post some questions as well, and I can answer those in sort of a Q&A style approach if you wish to use that time. So without further ado, I'll go into the content. So first of all, we're all here talking about carbon, and I just wanted to clarify that when we refer to carbon, this is sort of shorthand in the sense that what we're really talking about is greenhouse gases. Greenhouse gases, they're the gases that trap heat in the atmosphere. They let radiation from the sun in, but they don't let it out, like a greenhouse, right, that you might have in your garden. And the more and more of those gases that we have in the atmosphere, the more and more heat is trapped in the atmosphere, and that contributes to climate change. So therefore, when we talk about carbon, what we're actually saying is greenhouse gases. And when we report it, when we write it, CO2 is the chemical formula for carbon dioxide. But what you'll often see is when someone's talking or reporting their carbon emissions, they have a little E at the end, and the E stands for equivalent. So what it does is it encompasses all the greenhouse gases and puts them into a single metric so that you're able to know the quantum of greenhouse gases that you've produced. Um, so in the greenhouse gases, we've got carbon dioxide, the most common one, and CO2. But there's also methane, nitrous oxide, then groups of gases of the hydrofluorocarbons, perfluorocarbons, and sulfur hexafluoride. Um, you don't need to remember all of these, but I just wanted to clarify that actually when we talk about carbon, we're referring to greenhouse gases, we're referring to all these groups of gases. And what's important to understand as well, or maybe just interesting to understand, is that all of these different gases have different global warming potential. What does that mean? It means that when they trap, each one of them has got is better or than some of them are better than the others at trapping heat in the atmosphere. So some are really good at doing that. It's a bad thing, but they're just really good at it, and therefore they've got a larger global warming potential, which we refer to. So, for example, methane traps about 25 times more heat in the atmosphere than carbon dioxide does over a 100-year period, right? So if you're to release, one molecule of methane versus one molecule of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, over the first 100 years, methane is going to trap 25 times more heat than that carbon dioxide molecule would in the atmosphere. So nitrous oxide is even more potent, and so on and so forth. So that's why when we measure and we have that equivalent carbon CO2e that you see at the top there, that refers to greenhouse gases, and it's actually comparing them and normalizing all of them into a single unit based on their global warming potential. So when someone says, my emissions are, we produced 100 tons, we emitted 100 tons of carbon this year, what they actually most likely mean is we emitted 100 tons of greenhouse gases this year. So it includes contributions from various gases. That's it. So it's important to know this because as you'll see later, within this context of SECR, we need to measure all of those, and we're measuring greenhouse gases, not just carbon. So I'll do so. That was almost the first part of a jargon buster. When we talk about carbon, we're talking about greenhouse gases. This slide just goes into this in a little bit more detail. When we talk about carbon as well, you'll often hear people refer to scopes 1, 2, and 3. My scope 1 emissions, my scope 2 emissions, my scope 3 emissions. You might hear those. And essentially, this is about categories that come from the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, which is the most widely used global framework, the rule book, if you want, for measuring and managing greenhouse gases. It's been around since the Kyoto Protocol in 1992. I didn't make this up. And essentially, when you report on greenhouse gases, you need to categorize them by what's known as scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3. And essentially, those scopes are based on, and they help to understand what are you directly contributing, what is the source of emissions, what is the causes or what's influencing them. So they're actually quite helpful then in the analysis phase, those scopes. So I'll break those down. I mean, it's written on this slide at the top, but scope 1 is essentially refers to all the direct emissions from that you control. So, for example, if you are driving a car and let's imagine it's not an electric car. So you're driving a combustion engine car, you've got an exhaust pipe, you've got greenhouse gases that are coming out of that exhaust pipe. So you're physically driving that car, you're pressing down on the pedal, it's your motor that is turning the fossil fuel, let's say diesel, and out of the exhaust pipe come greenhouse gases that are released into the atmosphere. You're directly doing that. Other examples would be, you've got you burn gas for cooking, or in your stove or in your boiler. Um, you might have let's say in your company, you might have generators, or you might be a factory and you've got furnaces, and so you're physically burning things and releasing those gases into the atmosphere. All of that constitutes your scope 1 emissions. We then move on to scope 2. Scope 2 refers to any indirect emissions. So by indirect, I mean that you're no longer directly, burning something, or you've not got an engine that's yours, that's releasing gases into the atmosphere. But somebody else is doing that on your behalf. And scope 2 is about essentially the energy that you purchase from the grid. Obviously not your gas, because your gas, you're burning it. We've covered that in scope 1. But everything else, typically speaking, is just electricity. But sometimes you might have sort of district heating or cooling, or you might purchase steam. But essentially, typically speaking, it's about the electricity, the emissions associated with the electricity that you purchase from the grid. Okay, so when you purchase electricity, there's a utility provider who's generated that electricity. And unless they're a renewable energy provider, they will have generated some greenhouse gases to produce that electricity. And then that electricity will then go into the grid and for you to consume. Okay, so even though those emissions happen off-site, they're directly linked to your consumption of electricity. And so they're indirect emissions because they happen off-site, right? You're not producing them, but we cover them in what's known as scope 2. Finally is scope 3. And this is where things get slightly more complex, because this is all the other emissions that are indirect and that are across your value chain, both sort of upstream. So essentially in anything that's supplied to you, any sort of services that are provided to you, and the emissions associated with that, and downstream. So you might ship off your products. Your products might be consumed by individuals and then put in a bin, for example. Or someone might use your services. As part of using your services, they're generating carbon emissions. All of that goes into your scope 3, and we'll explore this in more detail in the next slide, actually. But so you can see all the examples and all the categories of scope 3 there on the graphic. So it might be emissions associated with goods and services that you procure. For example, you might procure a shoe or PPE equipment, and that PPE equipment has been manufactured. So someone's gone off and gotten raw materials, and they took that into a factory. They manufactured the PPE equipment, the garments, let's say. Then they package those up, and then they transport them and deliver them to you, right? And a lot of those activities associated with, generate greenhouse gases. And so you would be responsible indirectly for the emissions associated with all those steps to get that PPE equipment delivered to you. So hopefully that provides an example. Just a note, and we'll review this later, but Scope 3 isn't required in SECR. When organizations report their carbon emissions, they will, by default, you have to include your Scope 1 and your Scope 2. And very often you're encouraged to include Scope 3 where possible, where reasonable, where you think that you've got, hotspots that are material to your business. So, for example, you might be, I'll stick on the PPE equipment. You might be a distributor of PPE equipment. You're not the manufacturer, but you're the distributor, because it's really material. That PPE equipment is really material to you. You'd be strongly encouraged to include the PPE, the emissions associated with the production of the PPE equipment in your Scope 3, right? The production part, a lot of it will be in the Scope 1 of whoever produces that PPE equipment, and you would go into Scope 3. So there's double counting there along the supply chain, right? Someone's Scope 1 and Scope 2 will be your Scope 3, for example, right? So there is double counting along the supply chain. That's fine. That's how the methodologies work according to the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. That's how everyone does carbon accounting. So hopefully those two first slides there have sort of given a bit of definitions, what we mean by carbon. We actually mean greenhouse gases. And now we know that actually greenhouse gases are categorized when we report them into 3 scopes: Scope 1, Scope 2, Scope 3. We now know what those are. So that's a good start. However, we saw that Scope 1 and Scope 2 are seemingly relatively simple, because Scope 1 is just looking at what direct emissions do we have. So whether you've got vehicles, where you've got gas stoves, boilers, etc., furnaces. Scope 2, mainly speaking, electricity consumption. That's easy. Scope 3, a bit more nebulous, and there's a lot going on. So thankfully, there are methodologies to help you set boundaries. And when we set the boundaries, we look at 2 things. First of all, we start off with organizational boundaries, which helps to define which parts of your broader organization are you going to include in your carbon footprint. And then we look at the operational boundaries, which is, well, okay, now we know which parts of our organization, what within the activities that they do, are we going to include. So I'll explain that in more detail. We'll focus on the left-hand side, we'll focus on organizational boundaries, and then we'll move on to operational boundaries. Organizational boundaries, that defines which parts of your organizations you're going to include in your carbon footprint. It's really important for any reporting framework, including SECR, because you have to be clear and consistent and write down the methodology in terms of what you're counting, what you're including in your carbon footprint, and where the responsibility lies. For organizational boundaries, there are 3 main approaches that we look at. The operational control. This means that essentially you include the business, all parts of your business where you have an operational control. So you have the authority to introduce or implement policies. You can make decisions, on how that part of your business operates. So, for example, you might say, well, that always applies to all of what I do. But for some of you might be in joint ventures, for example, right? And that then goes into a grey area. So if you've said, well, we'll take an operational control approach, that's our rule in terms of how we're going to approach measuring our carbon emissions. That means that if you're in a joint venture, you might have a minority share in that joint venture, but let's say you actually manage it, you do the day-to-day operations, then that means that you'll say, okay, well, we're actually going to include that joint venture and their emissions in our carbon footprint, right? Because we've got control over it. We make the decisions. We might be a minority shareholder, might have 20% of it, but actually we're the ones who are tasked with operating it and managing it, and therefore we're the other approach, another approach is a financial control approach. And essentially that says, well, if we've got, typically speaking, if we've got a majority stake or we control the budgets, then we're going to include that into our carbon footprint. Right. So you look at your organization, you look at all the various assets, etc., that you have, and you say, well, here we've got financial control, so we're going to include that in there. All right. So you can see how that would apply with the joint venture approach. You might say, well, we're 10%. Because we're using financial control, we're 10% of we've got 10% of this joint venture. We don't really have financial control over it, therefore we can exclude it. Right? It's just another approach. Typically speaking, this is used for organizations, investors or financial sector as an approach. The final method is looking at equity share. And essentially, if your business owns 30% of a business, of another business subsidiary, for example, then you're going to calculate the emissions of that subsidiary, and you're going to say, well, because we own 30%, we're therefore responsible for 30% of the emissions. The financial control and equity share is very often applicable in sort of the investment heavy sectors and financial world. For the majority of businesses, operational control is the most common approach, right? Can we make a decision with this? Do we have control? Yes or no? In which case we go with that. So, and that's what the UK government recommends for SECR, because operational control really shows that you've got ability to act, and you can make a decision, and you've got the opportunity to change something to try and reduce the emissions. So just to recap on organizational boundaries, what you need to do is map out your organization, your legal entities, your subsidiaries, your joint ventures. If you have any, and then you say, do we control day-to-day operations here? Yes or no? If yes, if it's in scope. If no, it's not in scope. And then the important thing is you write this down. You write down your approach, right? So that you know it's consistent and you can refer back to it next year. This will help decide which parts of your business you're then going to deep dive into and look at the activities. The next point that it's almost rule setting, right? You're setting the rules of your game when you're to then go off and measure your carbon emissions. The next thing you need to do is operational boundaries, and that's helping to define, well, what activities are we going to include, and essentially that refers back to you have to include your scope 1 and scope 2, right? So you have to include your direct emissions for all carbon footprints. So you have to include all the direct emissions from sources you control. Gas combustion in boilers, ovens, furnaces, fuel used in your vehicles that you operate, refrigerant leaks from air conditioning, and so on and so forth. Your indirect emissions, so your grid electricity, you have to include that there. District heating or cooling, if that's applicable to you. And then there's the scope 3, and you look at essentially for scope 3, you look at, first of all, you can go back to your operational control and think, well, where do we have operational control? If that's the approach that you've taken, right, on the first 3 options. So where do we have operational control of anything any activities are in scope 3? And also you should try and include anything, as I said before, that you think is going to be really significant, whether it's going to be hotspots, So if you rely heavily on manufacturers of the manufacturing of PPE equipment because you're a PPE equipment distributor, that's your business, and you probably need to include the PPE equipment in there as your scope 3, right? So you're going to collect data around the emissions associated with the manufacturing of the PPE equipment. So that's what you need to look at. So hopefully that helps you sort of understand how you go from that definition and that graphic that I had on the first slide to then deciding, well, okay, how does this apply to us? Where does it apply to our business, and what activities are we going to go off and collect data on to be able to report our emissions? Now, all of that sets the rule book for us. So skip the slide. So then, once we've set the rule book, we actually need to go off and calculate our carbon emissions. And I've tried to simplify it down to 5 steps, particularly within the context of SECR, Streamlined Energy and Carbon Reporting. What you have to do, step 1, as we said, set your boundaries, organizational and operational, as we talked about in the previous slide. Step 2, you can then now go off and you know where to go and get data about which activities. So you go off, say, right, in this part of our organization, let's go and collect our electricity consumption, our fuel consumption, and maybe other data, data about how much PPE equipment they purchased, for example, if we felt that was relevant based on our setting boundaries. You go off and you collect that data. Once you've got that data, you then apply conversion factors. I'll speak about those, I think, about 2 slides' time. Conversion factors are about getting from amount of electricity consumed on your utility bill, it will say kilowatt hours of electricity consumed, into CO2e, carbon, greenhouse gas emissions, right? That end number. How do we go from one and jump to the next? Well, you've got these conversion factors, these numbers that you apply, and I'll explain that, I'll exemplify that in a few slides' time. Then once you've applied that, you then have to start getting carbon figures. So you can see, electricity, I've collected all the electricity that we consume across all our different parts of our business for boundary. I then apply the conversion factors. I then get a carbon number. Great. Oh, well, I know that electricity is in my scope 2. So that's what step 4 is about. It's breaking down by scopes, categorizing everything into the scopes. Because then what you'll do at the end is you'll add up everything that's fallen into scope 1, everything that's fallen into scope 2, everything that's fallen into scope 3. And then you'll tally those 3 things up to get your final footprint, your overall carbon footprint. And once you've got your overall carbon footprint, what you need to do, so that's step 5, right? Calculate the totals. For SECR, what you also need to do is you need to calculate some intensity ratios. I will list those later on, but the intensity ratios saying, well, now let's look at our carbon footprint by £1 million of turnover, by employees that we've got, and other relevant intensity ratios that might apply to you. So if you're a construction business, you might look at it by number of square meters that we've built, for example. If you're a manufacturing business, you might say, well, by carbon emissions per unit that we produce. We produce pencils. Well, you'll look at the carbon emissions per pencil, for example. Now, I must remind you that measuring carbon emissions must always be within the context of a wider carbon reduction strategy, right? Because measuring carbon emissions in itself isn't really an objective. It's useful, but the end goal is to reduce carbon emissions, right? That's why we're all here. We're trying to reduce our impact. We're just trying to do our bit, measuring great, but actually it's about reduction. And as a result, this is just a reminder of what the key components to a strategy might be. You've got the scoping element, which actually, we've talked about, the measuring element, which I touched upon in the previous slide. I'll go into more detail in the next slides. So that's the data collection and then transforming the data into carbon emissions. So then once you've got that, you should look at your data and go, right, our scope one is 90% of our total emissions. And a large part of our scope one is from the fossil fuel that we burn in the vehicles that we drive. How can we reduce that? Can we drive less? Are there ways that we can reorganize to be more efficient? Are there opportunities that when we need to change our vehicles, that we look at electric vehicles, for example? I'm not saying all of these things are right. They're contextual. So sometimes they might apply to you. Sometimes they might not. So I'm just giving those as examples. Often in a carbon reduction strategy, you will then have, it's an optional step, but you'll have some organizations want to offset. That's essentially, paying for someone else to reduce carbon emissions elsewhere. What you typically do is you say, here's our carbon emissions, we've done these things to reduce, but what's left over? Well, right now we're not in a position to reduce more, so we're going to offset. So we're going to pay someone else, for example, to go and plant some trees and look after those trees so that those trees soak up the equivalent amount of carbon emissions that we've been unable to avoid. Just a word on offsets. If you do decide that offset is part of your strategy, that is great. Please make sure to refer to accredited offsetting schemes. So you make sure that they're robust, that they're genuine, and there are some great organizations out there that do some great work, but there's also been some really bad press and organizations that don't do as great work in offsetting, and that's sell you sort of bogus offsets. So just be a little bit careful, a little bit of due diligence. It's quite easy to find the really good ones that are reputable. Feel free to reach out to me if you're unsure which ones those are. I'm not saying that offsetting, you have to do it, it's optional. Happily, I know it's a contentious issue, that's why I'm making a point of this. So some people like it, some people don't. If you're unsure, feel free to reach out. I'll happily give you some tips. And then finally, what you need to do in your carbon reduction strategy is actually report, communicate. In this instance, we're going to focus on how do we report to the UK government through the Streamlined Energy and Carbon Reporting regulation. But it might also be reporting in your sustainability strategy, in your annual update to your shareholders, and so on and so forth, right? But it's really important that you communicate and you talk about all the wonderful things that you're doing in that entire strategy. So this section was just a quick aside about how we're focusing on scoping, measuring today, and then reporting at the end. We're not focusing on reducing or on offsetting, but I just wanted to sort of give you that broader context. So 2 slides ago, I talked about how do you go off and report. So well, it's really simple. You go off and you've done your boundary setting, you've set your rules, you then go off and you collect the relevant data. And then you apply conversion factors. So this is what I mean by applying conversion factors. You've got activity data that you've collected from across your organization. Electricity consumption, fossil fuel consumption, how many pens did we purchase, and so on and so forth. And then you apply an emissions factor, and then that gives you the carbon emissions. As a reminder, when we talk about carbon emissions, we're talking about greenhouse gases, right? Equivalents. So here's an example. I looked at our organization and we consumed 250 litres of diesel this past year. We then go off and we apply a conversion factor. That conversion factor in the UK, we're so lucky that the government, and I'll provide a link to this in the follow-up, the government provides annually lists of conversion factors for the key things that will typically go into your carbon footprint. So like diesel, and it's got different types of diesel and so on. So you go off and you look at the database, you go, oh, diesel, well, it says, per litre, 2.758 kilograms of CO2 of carbon or greenhouse gases. So we go 250 times 2.758, that equals 689.5 kilograms of greenhouse gases emitted. Really simple. We know in this instance that diesel goes into our scope one, so then we categorize it. That's going to be part of my scope one. And I just go through that exercise and then I tally up everything into the different scopes and then tally that up to get my end result. So that's the methodology. That's how you apply conversion factors. Just really quickly, some examples here. I won't go through each one, but you can use these examples to sort of see how things compare. Electricity versus, red diesel in this instance, or emissions by different types of transport. What you can see there is that the train and the plane are by passenger. So for every single passenger, 500 passenger kilometers. So 500 for kilometers for one passenger to travel by train. The train might be full. It's just the averages it gives, or it might not be full, but we use averages. It will give you 18 kilograms carbon emissions. For the car, it's the entire car. So obviously, if you've got 5 people in the car, you could divide that per person by 5, right? Just wanted to clarify that point. But this gives you a sense of carbon emissions for typical things that will go into our carbon footprint. Just give another example, I do a lot of work in the built environment sector, and we often look at materials. So you can see that there's this big range of emissions based on the materials that you use. So often, architects and designers have to incorporate that into their thinking. But obviously, sometimes, steel, you can see it's at the top there. For 1 ton of steel, we produce 1,550 kilograms of carbon emissions. For 1 ton of aggregates, it's 5 kilograms. It's from a carbon perspective, it's much better to use aggregates and steel where you can. Now, obviously, steel has got its uses in lots and lots of places. So, and it's got lots of good things about it, and it's recyclable and so on and so forth. So carbon is one lens. It's not the only lens that you should look at, but this gives you a feel for how emissions may vary depending on materials that you use or activities that you do. So hopefully, it's clear that you go off and you go and collect data across your organization based on the rules that you've applied. You then go and find in the UK government website on the spreadsheet, which I'll provide a link to, you go and find the relevant conversion factors. You apply that. Now, one thing to say is that when you're going off and collecting the data across your business, be pragmatic, please. Don't let perfect be the enemy of good. If you can get the actual real data, great. If you need to use proxy data or sample data, that's fine. That's absolutely fine. Proxy data will be, well, we never collected how much fuel we consumed, but we know from our finance department that we spent £1 million on fuel this year, and therefore we know that the price of a litre is X. So I don't know the price of a litre of fuel. Therefore, this is the amount of fuel that we've consumed approximately. That's fine, as long as you document it. You say, look, maybe next year we'll try and actually collect the liters of fuels because it'll help us be more precise. And we'll take that approach. That would be an improvement. You could also use sample data. That's too difficult. Well, we don't have the spend on fuels, but we know that for this one vehicle, we tracked it over a month and we saw that they spent £200 on 2 fuel tanks. And as a result, we've got 20 fleets. So we'll multiply that by 20 by 12 for the whole year. And that's how much we think approximately the amount of fuel that we use across our business. That's fine. Just be pragmatic. Don't let perfect be the enemy of good. And then just document. Just write down your, side note, this year we used sample data for our fuel consumption um, because we didn't have the real data. That's fine. We'll try and improve on it next year, maybe. Finally, in terms of what else you can do, you can also look at, there's organizations, you might have smart meters in place. You can put things in place, fuel cards. You might have building management systems that automatically spin out the amount of electricity being used. You could use software platforms, that help you to put in all the data, or that help you integrate all this information. Just as a side note, at Action Sustainability, we operate a reporting platform to help with these types of things. And notably, we actually provide a free carbon calculator for organizations in the UK and Ireland. My colleagues just posted a link to it in the chat. So for anyone who's new to this, you can go and use the calculator and take you step by step everything that I've spoken about, and it'll help you go through your carbon footprint. Yeah, feel free to use that, please. It's free, and we provide loads of support for it as well. There's no catch, honestly. So you can go and use that today to measure your carbon footprint. As a side note, it is tailored slightly to SMEs, and it is also slightly tailored to SMEs in the built environment space. But actually, we've got lots of accounting firms, legal firms using it, lots of different types of businesses using it that aren't necessarily in the built environment, and all plumbers and bricklayers using this system, and it works completely fine. So for that as well. So feel free to use it. But the point I'm trying to make here is, think about ways that will help you do this really efficiently, instead of going and having someone collecting the information, writing it on spreadsheets, etc. Think about ways that you could do this efficiently. I'm sure in your organizations you've got lots of examples where you've done data collection in an efficient manner. So just apply that type of thinking there. So this is all about measuring your carbon footprint. And you need to do all of this to comply with the star of the show today, which is the Streamlined Energy and Carbon Reporting. So Streamlined Energy and Carbon Reporting was introduced by the UK government in April 2019, and it's part of a broader effort, part of broader UK strategy to tackle climate change. Some of you might recall that before we have the sort of complex mechanism called the CRC, Energy Efficiency Scheme, and essentially Streamlined Energy and Carbon Reporting, just its purpose is to streamline, to make consistent carbon reporting and make it sort of accessible. Some of its core objectives are about promoting accountability and transparency around energy and carbon, around helping businesses identify opportunities for reduction, and ultimately contribute to the UK's legally binding target of net zero by 2050. So the UK government has said we're going to achieve net zero by 2050. So one of the first steps is, well, let's get businesses to measure their carbon footprint, measure their energy consumption, and report that back into us. And I'll explain that in more detail. Just so you know, this also fits in with sort of other mechanisms, other tools that are in place, some regulatory ones, some voluntary tools. So in the UK, we've got ESOS, the Energy Savings Opportunity Scheme, for example. We've also got mandatory greenhouse gas reporting for listed companies. We've got voluntary initiatives like the Carbon Disclosure Project, the Science Based Targets Initiative, and so on and so forth. Essentially, there's sort of a growing shift towards measuring carbon and making it visible and publicly saying what are our carbon emissions as businesses and for governments to understand that. There's just a growing shift, and that's not going away. So the need is increasing. And I'm sure as well that many of you are bidding for work. You're responding to tenders, and you're asked, "What are your carbon emissions? Are you measuring it?" and so on and so forth. So it's sort of become part of business as usual. It's mandatory, right? So this fits in with that whole agenda. With the streamlined energy and carbon reporting mechanism or regulation, um, we need to understand who needs to comply. So first of all, we're talking about UK registered companies and LLPs that meet at least two. So it's not meeting two, it's at least two of the three criteria. Have you got 250 employees or more? Yes or no? Do you have a turnover of 36 million employees? Yes or no? Do you have a balance sheet of 18 million or plus? Yes or no? Finally, are you a quoted company? So, are you a quoted company? That just sort of automatically puts you in there. And then, if you're not a quoted company, do you meet at least two of the criteria that you've got on the slide there? So ask yourselves that. And if you are, then you legally have to report, comply with the Streamlined and Energy carbon regulation, carbon reporting regulation. You have to comply with that. If you're not, it doesn't mean don't measure your carbon emissions. Okay, forget about it. It doesn't apply to me. Actually, as I said, you're probably being asked by clients. You might have made a commitment by, just voluntarily as your organization. You might have signed up to a voluntary initiative like the Science Based Targets Initiative or Carbon Disclosure Project. So it doesn't mean carbon reporting doesn't apply to you. It just means that you're not under this specific regulation to measure your carbon and report it under the guidelines of the SECR. So do you need to comply? Look at this slide. If yes or no, then you do. If yes, then you do. If no, then you don't have to do this, but it's still good to measure your carbon emissions. I'll just note there that there are some exemptions. There are some exemptions. There are certain types of organizations. If you've got an exemption, there might be some organizations where there's it's like a risk to the business for them to report their carbon emissions, like a real big risk that the UK government will say, okay, that's fair enough. But you know it if you've got an exemption or not. So I would say that 99% of organizations that fit these criteria, they have to report. If someone's interested in exemptions because they're unsure, I can send them to you by email afterwards. So feel free to reach out. So, streamline energy and carbon reporting. Earlier on, we talked about how to get a carbon report, and then here, this is specifically within streamline energy and carbon reporting. What do you need to do? Well, you need to produce a report that essentially has three sections to it. In each section, it's important to write down your methodology. So the boundaries, any data where, any methodology where you say, well, this, our fossil fuel consumption, it's an estimation based on sample. Don't go into too much detail, but just provide a little bit of context. What goes into your report? Three sections. The first section is about total UK energy use. You report that in kilowatt hours, and you say how many kilowatt hours of electricity did we use? Grid electricity, and then on-site generation. You might have solar panels on site, for example. You might have wind turbine on site. You might have some sort of biomass equipment. And so you would just put how much electricity in kilowatt hours from grid and on-site generation. You split those two out. You then report how much gas, natural gas, LPG for heating or for boilers. right? You write that down in kilowatt hours. And then all your transport fuels. I apologize there. I will rectify before I send this slide over. There's a fourth bullet point. The fourth bullet point is actually it's actually in the third one. I must have entered, and I've just realised that I must have pressed enter and it's gone and created a fourth bullet point. It's actually three bullet points, just transport fuels, your petrol, your diesel, your red diesel, your biofuels, right? You report those. All of that in kilowatt hours. If you're not sure how to go from fuels, you'll probably have liters into kilowatt hours. Then the UK government provides those conversions as well in that same conversion factors list that I talked about, which I'll share a link to. It's a spreadsheet. The next part of your report should essentially say, well, our scope 1, scope 2, and our scope 3. Scope 3 is optional. Streamlined energy and carbon reporting regulation doesn't say you have to include scope 3, but it's highly encouraged. And just say which aspects of your scope 3, write down your methodology for that if you include it. And then you provide intensity metrics. Now, the top two intensity metrics are a must-have. So it's your total carbon emissions by £1 million of turnover and your total emissions by full-time employees. And then you've got just examples of just provide any other intensity metric that I think applies to you by project or by client, or by floor space or by unit produced or by kilometers driven because we're a taxi company, for example. Anything that you think, well, that actually makes sense. This is what we do, and therefore, by number of meals that we provided because we're a catering business, for example, right? So you just put that in there. Now, where does this all go? I've been talking about this, but where does it all go? Well, first of all, it all goes into your financial reporting. Actually, it goes alongside that. You align this data to your financial year, and you must use the DEFRA of UK government conversion factors that I talked about. That I'll send you a spreadsheet for. And you do all of this information, and you provide it based on the slide before, like in those three categories with your methodology. And you add this to your annual director's report or in your annual accounts that you submit to Companies House, right? For listed companies, you provide this in your annual report under your greenhouse gas disclosures that are mandatory that you have to do. And all of that needs to be signed off by your board, by your directors, and it needs to be published publicly. So obviously, if it's in Companies House, it'll be public, but put it on the website and so on and so forth. That's what you need to do. If you've done that, all of those things, you've complied with SECR, Streamlined Energy and Carbon Reporting. So hopefully that gives you some practical steps and understanding of what you need to do, how you get there. I just want to finish off on a final word, which is that I've mentioned that with SECR and actually with all carbon reporting, typically speaking, scope 3 is voluntary. So you don't have to include scope 3. You could just say, well, I'll just do my scope 1 and scope 2. However, you're always very encouraged, particularly if in your scope 3, you're going to have, some large hotspots of carbon emissions that are really material to your organization. Think about including those in. I'm not going to list all the sort of different disclosure frameworks and standards and so on and so forth. The trend at the moment, and this is only going to carry on, is that scope 3 is becoming more and more encouraged. It's becoming sometimes heavily encouraged. And so I would recommend that as businesses, you start mapping out your value chain and understanding where are hotspots and maybe actually starting to collecting as much scope 3 as you can, because this is a hunch, but this is a hunch based on the observation that scope 3 is becoming a big topic that everyone talks about, and it's becoming more and more emphasized. And therefore, I would think that you are going to be required in the future to include scope three. And it's going to be a requirement from your clients, in tenders. It's starting to be. It's going to be a requirement in SECR. It's going to be, or under another regulation that we have. Is going to be required, under lots of different standards and frameworks around sustainability and carbon reporting. So I would just say, get ready for it, essentially. And there we go. So I will stop there. We've got a couple of minutes. Anyone can ask questions. I see that someone's already asked me for recommendations around offsetting organizations. So I will reach out and get back to that individual on that. If anyone's got any other questions or requests, feel free to email me. We'll be following up with the slides. You can see my email there. It's charles.nord@actionsustainability.com. Just reminding you that I operate a reporting platform. So if you think, well, I've got quite a complex organization and I'd really need some help with streamlining the way we collect our data and use that to automatically calculate our carbon emissions and produce some nice reports, we can do that for you. We create we configure our platform to be really bespoke and fit your processes and ways of working in your organization. So feel free to reach out if that's of interest. And I hope you've enjoyed the session, found something useful, and that you feel confident that you know what SECR is about, whether you need to apply or whether you need to comply or not. And I've been told there are some questions in the Q&A. Okay, which I have not seen. So apologies. I'll look at the questions. So there's someone asking for offsetting, someone asking for conversion factors for finished products, i.e. electrical equipment. Very good question. The UK government factors don't provide many for finished products. I can send up in some example databases, but a quick online search will help you find relevant databases based on your sector. I'll send a couple as example. One really good one is called the ICE in the UK. It's got loads and loads of conversion factor for manufactured products. Yes, correct. So someone else is saying this is SECR has been in place since 2019. It's been mandatory to report since then. Yes, it has been. The reality is that the UK government's not been great at, slapping people on the wrist for slapping people on the wrist. I think that's the expression for not complying. I think that's going to change over time, and you do risk quite hefty fines if you get caught out. So if you haven't been, I think start complying. Yeah. Someone else is asking, I'm on a construction site and I'm not paying for the electricity. There it goes back to which approach did you take? You're not paying for the electricity, but if you're using the electricity, you might think, well, actually, we've got operational control over that, so we're going to use it. So you've got to make a decision there in terms of where you would put it. If your client is the owner of the site is paying for the electricity, are they charging you for it in some ways? Might be a question. But ultimately, if you're actually plugging machinery in and using that electricity, well, it means that you've got operational control over it. I'd include it in your scope too. Hopefully that's answered the questions that we've had there. We'll reach out right away via email with some follow-up materials. 1 minute over time. So thank you very much. I'll close it here, but thank you very much for attending today. I hope you found this useful and have a great end of week. Bye-bye.